So I have shared the slide. It is visible now.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay,
Yes, sir.
Yes,
fine.
sir.
Yes, sir.
So okay.
Yes, sir.
So this is what we are discussing in the last lecture, that there are in a 8086 processor, there are around 10 instructions that constitute around 96% in a typically benchmark program that was run for testing. So these are the frequently used instructions, and we know that the architects use a common case first. So once you know the instructions which are frequently used, so you can try to, the architect can try to figure out to how to make these instructions faster so that the entire program can run the faster. Then let's look at certain on the control flow instructions. And there are typically the four types of control flow instructions. This jump, these are the unconditional control transfer. Look at in a, what happens in a control flow instructions, the flow is transferred from one location to the another location. It's not the next sequential locations, it's transferred from one location to another location which is far away from the current location. It's not we're not talking about the next sequential location. In that case, the program counter will be this enough to get the address of the next instruction to be executed. So there are four types of control flow instructions. One is jump. This is the unconditional transfer. That means you execute an instruction called a jump, and without any specifying any condition, you give the target address. So once the target address is known, it moves from that from that location to another location which target is already specified in the instruction, or the target itself is a part of the instruction now. Next is the conditional branches. So here you test a condition, and depending on the condition, the control is transferred. It can be a branch 0, branch not equal to, branch equal to. So there are many the conditional branch instructions. So the branching takes place only when the condition is satisfied. So again you move. So the target address is unknown. Look at in the jump case, you know the target address where to go, but in case of a conditional branch, you don't know the target address. The target address is to be also be found out. Next, there is procedure call and the procedure return. Look at, in case of a procedure call, again you move from one location of the memory to the another location of the memory and start executing the call function or the call procedures. Then there is a procedure return back. So when you return from the procedure, again you have call back to the main function. So there are typically four ways the instructions four way where the control can be transferred using a jump, the branch, then a procedural call, and the procedural returns. Now let's know what is the relative frequency of these events. So there are four different types of control flow events. So let's know what is the relative frequency of this event, and it is essential to know the relative frequency of each of this event, because each event is a different. A jump is a different way to handle, so is the procedure call and the procedure returns. And they may use different instructions, and they have also a different behavior. Each instruction has a different behavior also. So this shows the relative frequency of the branch instructions, and this has been categorized into three types. Look at the procedure call and return is put at one category, jump and the conditional branches is in different categories. So they are classified into three categories here. And if you look at in a typical benchmark program that is run to test the occurrence of the relative frequency of the branch instruction, the conditional branch dominates both for the integer program as well as the floating point program. So this says the conditional branch dominates. So when the conditional branch dominate, again look at, we are discussing all these instructions to know that where to put the resources. Now once you know that majority of the instructions that executed are conditional branch, then the architect will figure out how to handle the conditional branches in a much faster way or more efficient way, so that the entire the programs run faster. Then we are looking at the branch instructions. So in every of these branch instructions, the target has to be known. Then once you know the address of the target, then what is the addressing modes to be used in each of these control flow instruction. Now the destination address of the control flow instruction must always be specified. Now in all the case, whether it is a jump, or whether it is a conditional branch instruction, or a procedural call, or a procedural return, we have to know the destination address. Then once you know the you have to specify the destination address, then you need to find out what is the addressing mode to be used to specify the destination address. And in majority of the cases, the destination is explicitly specified in the instruction, except in procedure return. So in majority of the cases, the destination address is explicitly specified, other than the procedure return. The procedure return is the only exception. Now this is because the return target is not known at the compile time. Now once it is explicitly specified, then the target address is known. So once you know the target address, then at the compile time you can find out where is the target. And in the procedural return, you do not know where to be written. So so you cannot figure out the return at the compile time. And then how to specify now the destination address?
Sir.
Yes.
So why doesn't, in the case of procedure return, the control goes back to the original procedure caller? Like, shouldn't that be the destination address for procedure return?
Now, where is the let's look at during the execution of the program. You do not know in which part of the memory the program is going to reside. So it is not known at the compile time. Right? I do not know once you this can at a compile time, it is unknown where part in which part of the program a particular procedure is going to run, and which part of the memory it will be run. So it cannot be the procedure return. You cannot determine to which memory location you have to return after a procedure call. So it cannot figure out at the compile time. Because it cannot be done at the compile time, then you have to find out and some other mechanism to specify the procedure return. It's okay?
Okay, sir.
Then how to specify the address? And one of the common way to provide the address is to provide a displacement. And what does the displacement does? The displacement is added with the PC. Displacement gives the address of the target. So once you provide the displacement along with the instructions, then you add up the displacement with the current what is the value of the PC, then you get the target address. And this type of addressing is called the PC relative addressing. Now the control flow instructions where the displacement is provided to get the address of the target, we call all this the PC relative addressing. The PC relative branches or the jumps are advantaged because the target is often near the current instruction. Let's look at we are specifying the target, and it has been found that the majority of the target are very near to the current instructions. So once since the target are current to the are very near to the current locations, then the target offset that we are providing will be of a lesser size, so then that will also take a less number of bits to specify the target. So this requires a fewer bit to specify the position relative to the current PC. So if the target is far away, then the offset, the displacement that you are going to provide will be a larger value. Now, if it will be a larger value, then you have to specify by more number of bits. So if my target is 32 locations away from the current location of the instructions, then I can specify the target by means of 5 bits. And if it is 64, then I have to use a 6 bits. and if it's more than that, then accordingly the bits has to be changed. Now these bits will also consume your the instruction. This will also play a role in determining what will be the size of the instruction, and size of the instruction in terms is going to affect the size of your program. Now the PC relative addressing also permits the code to run independently of where it is located. Now, so the PC, once it becomes PC relative addressing, you can place the code at any place in the memory, and it can be run independently. And this we call it a this property is called the position independent. That means you can place the code at any location, and you can run at any location. Now let's look at the return and the return ones. In return and indirect jumps. Now, in case of indirect jumps, that you specify the address of the register, and the address of the register will give you the you specify register, and the content of the register will give you the address of the memory location. This is called the indirect jumps. So in in return and indirect, look at in a return, we do not know the return address, the target to return at the compile time, because you do not know the target to return at the compile time. Then we need to find out a mechanism how to specify the target address of these instructions. In procedure return and indirect jumps, the target is not known at the compile time. So since the target is not known at the compile time, we cannot use a PC relative addressing. Look at, in case of a PC relative addressing, we specify a displacement, and the displacement is known at the compile time, and the displacement is added with the PC to get the address of the target. But in case of return and indirect jump, we do not know the displacement at the compile time, as a result of which the PC relative addressing cannot be used. So if we are not able to use the PC relative addressing, then there must be some other method for addressing these instructions. So there must be a way to specify the target dynamic. Look at, in this, the target has to be known dynamically. So there must be a way to specify the target dynamically, so that it can changes in a dynamically as the instruction executing, the target is also changes. So there must be a way to specify how this target can keep on changing as the instruction is executing. Now, one of the simplest way that you can use a register. Now, name a register that contains the target address. So, since here in this case, you can simply specify the name of a register. Now, when you specify the name of the register itself will contain the target address. Then, whenever the target change the content of the register. So you need to the program has to need to write into the register, and while executing, you simply access the register to get the target address. So you name a register, that is as simple as this, by naming a register that contains the target address, or the jump may permit an addressing mode to be used to supply the target. So the jump instruction can provide some other mechanism to specify the target address, but mostly the mechanism to specify the register and the address of the register, the address of the memory locations of the target is written into this register. The register indirect jumps are also useful for 4 important features. Now let's look at where these register indirect jumps. Now let's look at what we are doing. The register indirect, we are using a register from the available register set, which will specify the address of the target. So if the program into access if the address is changing dynamically, then the program has to write into the specific register, and you need to access it access the register to get the address of the target. Now let's look at the where the register indirect jumps are used. Now these are being used in all the programs, many of the programming language features. For example, the case and switch statement. These statements, these two case and switch statements are found in most language. And here we had a number of alternatives. And when we have a number of alternatives, we have to select one of the alternatives. Now, when to select one alternative, then you need to find out what is the address of the target. And address of the target obviously is written into some register, and we access that register, and it is being done. Next is the the virtual functions and methods. Now the virtual functions and methods are available in the object-oriented programming language like C++ and Java. Now what happens in these virtual functions and virtual methods, depending upon the type of the argument you call the function. So the functions can have a same name, and depending upon the number of argument you pass, the different functions are called. So you had also a number of alternatives. So when you have number of alternatives, there is to a mechanism to find out which alternatives or which target to be accessed. Higher order functions or the function pointers. This is supported in the language like C and C++, and where the function is passed as an argument. So when you're passing a function as argument, then you're you have to specify the address of the argument that you are going to pass. Then this is another is dynamically shared libraries. In case of a dynamically shared libraries, this allow the library to be loaded and linked at a runtime when it is actually invoked. Now, if you do it at a compile time, then library will be loaded and linked, but it may happen that you may not require it. You load and link a library if you do it at a compile time, and you may not require that one also. So if your program is not calling that particular library, then there's no point of having that library in the program while executing this one, while executing the program. So this dynamically shared library also, it load and links the library when the program is running. Now let's look at these four targets, that case statement, virtual function, higher order functions, and dynamically shared libraries. In all these cases, the target address is not known at a compile time. And what it does, so the target address is loaded from the memory into a register before the register indirect jump is used. Now, all branches generally use the PC relative addressing. Now, when you use a PC relative addressing, then we must know that how far is the branch target away from the current branch instruction. So currently you are executing a branch instructions and you do not know where the target is. Then what will be we have to know the how far the target address is for the current branch instruction. Now this is essential to know the distribution of the target from the current branch instruction. Once you know the distribution of the displacement, what is the distribution of the displacement from the current branch instruction, then you can specify what will be the branch offset, and branch offset actually that is going to affect your instruction and in terms of the program. So knowing the displacement helps in choosing the branch offset. So once you know that what will be the maximum or what will be the majority of the displacement from the current branch instruction. So
hello, sir.
Yes.
Sir, in the previous cases where like the register indirect is used, you told that the target address will be loaded into the register before the jump instruction is used.
Right.
or executed. How is that done, or who does that, sir?
It is done while the program is running. Dynamically it is done. There are two things. One is statically, the other one is dynamically. If it is to be done statically, then it is to be done by the compiler. And if it is to be done dynamically, there is a hardware built into the system which is going to do this job. So these are at the runtime.
Okay, sir.
So once you do it at runtime, so there are hardwares to do the job.
Okay, sir.
Okay. So the displacement, so we have to know the displacement now. So how does the displacement is going to affect? The displacement affect the instruction length. If you had a more displacement, then the that will occupy the your instruction space, and if you have a larger, if the instructions are large in size, so it will affect the program length. So if it affects the instruction length and the encoding of the instruction, we'll also later on we'll see how the instructions are encoded. So let's look at this displacement. This shows the branch displacement, and if you look at on the x-axis, we have the percentage of the distance from the current branch instructions, and this is for SVM benchmark program, and this was an average for the displacement integer program and for the floating point program. And if you look at from this the figure, we can make certain conclusions from this figure. And most branches are forwarding branches. Forwarding branches means if you are in instruction, let's say 4, then your next jump is somewhere in 50, 60 or away from 8. So you call the forwarding branches. And if you are in instruction, let's say a 4, and if you are moving to instruction 1, we call this a backward branches. So most branches are forward, and it is observed that 75% of the branch instructions are forward branches. And most branches branch to a nearby location. If majority of the branches are branched to the nearby locations, so the number of bits required to specify the displacement, or you sometimes you call the offset, will be less. So most frequent branches in the integer program are target that are encoded into 4 and 8 bits. So the displacement can be encoded into 4 and 8 bits that can be added off with the PC to get the target address. And short displacement will sufficient for branches. Now, for most branch instructions, if you look at it is encoded into 4 and 8 bits, so the displacement are a short displacement. Now, if you are having a short displacement, then we can get the encoding density by having a shorter instructions with a smaller branch displacement. Now we say you are gaining a encoding density. That means the number of bits required to encode an instruction is less. And in terms of the number of bits, when you compile a program, it also take a less number of bits in the memory. So we call the better coding density. Next, look for the conditional branches. The most changes in the control flow are the branches. Then how to specify the branch condition? So it's a conditional branch. Now, if it is a conditional branch, then you need to specify a mechanism for specifying the condition. Then how to specify the condition? There are 3 primary techniques used to specify the branch condition. One is the condition code, condition register, then compare and branch. So let's look at how the conditions are tested in each of these the technique. So let's look at the condition codes. And condition codes are, for example, where the condition codes are tested are all the Intel processor, ARM. And how does it test? It tests the special bit set by an ALU. Suppose you perform an arithmetic operation and the result of that operation may be a 0. So it tests for a 0 flag. So you can say jump on 0, or the flag is set or the 0 flag is not set. You can say jump on 0 or a jump on non-zero. So the test the special bit set by the ALU operation and possibly under a program control. Moment you say it is possibly under a program control, so you execute an instruction and result of the instruction is going to affect the bits, and you test the bit to perform the operation. So it has a certain advantage and disadvantage. Let me not go back to the advantage and disadvantage. It's going to kill some other time. Now let's look at the condition register. The MIPS uses the condition register. Now what does this processor does? It tests an arbitrary register with the result of a comparison. Now what it does, the it performs a comparison operation, and the result of the operation is going to return into a register, and that register will be tested for the condition. So a specific register will be tested while we're discussing later part in the discussing the later part, when you discuss about the pipelining and testing for the condition codes. We'll use the MIPS architecture, and the MIPS architecture uses a register R1, it's a specific register R1 to test for the condition code. So any operations that you perform, the result of these operations is written back into the specific register, and it tests this. It tests the register for the condition. Then compare in the branch. Compare in the branch. This uses a the VAX machine and some RISC architecture. This compare is a part of the branch instruction. Now when it executes a branch instruction, the part of the branch instruction also contain a comparison instruction. So compare is a part of the branch, and often the comparison is limited to a subset. Now the compare and the branch, in many of the cases, the compare are in many branch, the comparison is makes a simple equality test or a inequality test for a comparison. So the comparisons are a large number of comparisons are simple test, that equality test or inequality test, and a large number of the comparisons are compared with the 0. So in case of a branch, it's a compare and compare and test with some condition to carry out the branch instruction. The comparisons are a very simple test, whether equality or inequality test, and a large number of comparison are is compared with the 0 cases. Now the frequency of different comparisons used. So let's look at the frequency of the different comparisons. Let's look at these comparisons. So if you look at the comparisons, less than, equal, greater than, equal and not equal. These are the number of comparisons that we make. Now if you look at this comparison, then the less than and less than equal to predominates. If you look at here, this is typically source for a specific benchmark program where the less than and less than equal to the predominates. Then the other branch instruction again the same. So when you discuss this, the frequency of occurrence of different conditional branches, then when you know the frequent cases, so the use again the most common case fast to how to make those cases the faster. Now let's look at the another case of procedure call and returns and how these procedure calls and returns are handled. Now in procedure calls and returns, you transfer the control from one location to the another location, but it includes some saving of the states. Now in almost in almost all the procedure call, the return address must be saved. And we know that this happens in every procedure call. The return address must be saved somewhere in some special purpose register or some other location, so that you can retrieve the return address when the program when the control is to be transferred from the procedure call. Sometimes the general purpose registers are used to store the return address, and when you make a procedure call, sometimes the whole register set may need to be saved when you call it. That is what is it, when you make a procedure call, then before you transfer the call, it may need to save the entire register set or a subset of the register that need to be saved before the control is being transferred. Now, if the register has to be saved before the call is being transferred, then there are two basic conventions which are used to save the register. One is the caller saving, the other one is called the callee saving. In case of a caller saving, the calling procedure has to save the register it want to preserve for access after the call. What he says that in case of a caller saving, the procedure which is making a call will save those register which is going to use after it returns from the called procedure. So it has to save all this register. Then in case of a callee saving, the called procedure must save the register it want to use. So this is just the opposite of the caller saving. The called procedure, the procedure to which the control is to be transferred, it will save those register which it is going to use in that procedure. So there are two different approaches, the caller saving and the callee saving. Now the compiler, now there is a problem with both in the callee saving, but the compiler prefers the caller saving to avoid complication from a global variable allocation. So if we have a global variable and that global variable is used by both the procedure, then there will be slightly complications arises in case of the caller saving, in case of a callee saving, as a result of which the compiler prefers to use the caller saving. Now let's look at what will be the complication that arises if you are using a callee saving the procedure. You have two procedure P1 and P2. There are two procedure P1 and P2, and there is a global variable called X, and that global variable is used by P1 and P2. Let's P1 call P2, and let's P1 call P2, and P1 is allocated to P1 using the global variable X, and that global variable X is allocated to a register. Then P1 must save X to a place P2 known before the call to P2. So before the control is transferred to the P2, the P1 must save the content of the register to a location which will be known to the P2, that the value of X will be present there. Now let's look at the problem that might be arrive if you are not saving the variable. If the procedure P1 is not going to save the variable X before it transfers the control to P2. Now let's look at the call is let's look at why it is need to be saved. Let's look at this one. Let's let's look at for the call is saving. Let's forget about the caller saving. Let's look at the call is saving. Now, so what happens? They say procedure P1, there is a global variable X. Then procedure P1 using the global variable X, and it called the procedure P2. Now the procedure P2, it knows that it's not going to use the variable X. So since the procedure P2 is not going to use the variable X, so it will not going to store the register X, register where the value of X is written. So P2 is not going to read X and call another procedure P3. So this is the transition. P1 has called P2. P2 is calling P3. So there are three procedures: P1, P2, and P3. P1 is using the variable X. It has called the procedure P2, and we are using a call is saving mechanism, and P2 is not going to use the variable X. So since P2 is not going to use the variable X, so it is not going to save the register where the value X is present. Now P2 calls P3 and P3 access X. Now when P3 access X, then let's look at P2 has not stored X. As a result of P2 has not stored X. So when P3 access X, when it gets the X, then it is not going to get the updated value of X. So there is a complicated problem. So there is a problem in the call is saving. That is the reason why the compiler prefers to go for a caller saving, and this will be more complicated if the procedures are compiled separately. So this year the P2 and P3 are compiled separately, then and to compile separately, and the P2 when they are compiled separately, then the P3 cannot know from which location is going to get the recent value of the X. So there is a problem here. That's the reason why we go for a caller saving. Now let's look at what happens in a caller saving. In case of a caller saving, before P1 before P1 transfers the control, it knows it will store to the location where P2 can save. Now before P2 can transfer the control, again it will store the location where P3 can see, and whenever the P3 accesses the value of X, it knows the location from where X is to be retrieved. Next, let's look at the encoding and decoding of the instruction set. Now, why you need the encoding and decoding? The instructions and all instructions are encoded into a binary representations, and this binary representation is executed by the processor. And these binary representations is not only affect the size of the compiled program, but also the implementation of it also affect the processor implementation. Now, how does this binary representation is going to affect the processor implementation? Now look at it. Fetches a instructions which is in a binary string. Then the processor must to decode this binary string to find out the operations and these operands. So the encoding itself is going to affect the implementation of the processor. All operations are encoded into a field we call the operation field or the opcode field. And now once we had a opcode field, look at the instructions has a we can broadly classify the instructions into two fields. One is the operation field and the operand field. What operation that you have to perform, you obtain from the operation field, and the operand need to be extracted from the operand field. Now, once you need to have the operand, then how do you specify the operand, and what is the addressing mode to be used to specify the operand? Then, so you had a opcode field. This encoded into inst operations are encoded into the opcode field. Then how to encode the addressing mode with the operations? We know that extracting the opcode field, you'll able to know the operations, but how do you encode the addressing modes? The addressing modes, the type and size of the operand will affect the operations, and the type. This will affect the addressing mode, size and the type of operand, and all the type of the operation. All will going to affect the encoding of the instructions. Now, we are specifying now the instructions, the operations are encoded into a field called opcode field. Then all the operands must be encoded into a field where from where you can extract the operand. Then how do you encode the addressing mode for each of these operand? Depending upon the range of the addressing mode and the degree of independence between the opcode and the addressing modes that will be used. Now let's look at the instructions with a large addressing modes and instructions with few addressing modes. So if you had a many addressing modes and many operands, and each operand is in the each operand use addressing modes, then you need to use a separate address specifier for each operand. So the encoding scheme for the operands is now depends on the how many addressing modes you'll be using and how many operands will be specified in the instructions. If we have a many operands and every operand you'll use an addressing modes, then you need to use a separate address specifier for each of the operand. That every operand has its own address specifier. For example, you can have a 5 to 10 operands in the instructions with around 10 addressing modes for each. That means every operand can be specified by a different all the existing addressing modes. Suppose there are 10 addressing modes and operand can be specified by means of any of the addressing modes. Then you need to specify the address specifier, which addressing mode is being used to get the address of the operand. So what does the address specifier tells? The address specifier tells what addressing modes is needed for each operand. So large combinations. So what will happen if you have a large number of combinations, then it is going to affect the size of your instructions. So for every addressing mode, for every operand, there is a specific addressing mode. So there is a specific addressing mode. So there will be a bits to specify the addressing mode. So that will consume all the that will consume a large amount of space in your instruction. So the address specifier tell the what addressing mode is needed for each of the operand. Now, instead of let's look at another extreme case. So there are two cases. In one extreme, we had a large number of operands can be specified instruction, and every operand can specify by means of a large number of addressing modes at one extreme. Then let's look at another extreme of a machine with one memory operand and one or two addressing modes. So this the other extremes is a load and store architecture, where in case of a load and store architecture, there is only two instructions that refer to the memory, either the load and the store. There is only two instructions refer to the memory. This is another extremes of it. If one memory operand in case of a load and store machine and one or two addressing modes. So in the other extremes of the machine, then the encoding, the addressing mode is a part of the opcode. So in such a machines where there is a only one memory operand and there is one or two addressing mode, then the addressing mode can be encoded as a part of the opcode. Look at in one extremes we had a opcode, and for every operand we have a addressing modes. Then the addressing modes will specify how each of the operand is going to access. In case of an other extreme, there is a instruction can have only a one memory operand, and there can be one or two addressing modes. In such a case, the addressing mode can become a part of the opcode. So when you decode the operation, then the operation itself, the opcode itself will specify what addressing mode will be used. So a separate address specifier is not required in such machine. Now the number of register and a number of addressing mode is going to affect the size of the instruction. Now if we have a large number of register, so if we have a large number of register, to specify the register it will also take some number bits, and if we have large number of addressing modes, then there has to be a mechanism to specify the addressing modes. So the mechanism to specify the addressing mode will also consume some number of bits in the instruction. So that is going to indirectly affect the size of the instruction, and which indirectly affects the size of the program. The instruction size will directly affect the size of your program. So how this number of register and addressing modes is also going to affect indirectly going to affect the instruction, the size of the code generated for the program. Now an architect must balance several competing forces when encoding an instruction set. So let's look at what are the competing forces, the competing forces that an architecture must balance when encoding an instruction set. Looks like we had a discuss about a variable. So we'll discuss now the different variable instruction, fixed length instruction, and a mixed mode in between the variable instruction and a fixed length instruction. Now we had a desire to have many register and many addressing mode. An addressing mode is specific. So it is from the programmer point of view, you'll have as many registers as possible, as many addressing modes as possible. Now look at in the last slide we discussed the large number of register and large number of memory addressing modes, which is going to directly impact on the instruction size, which will directly impact on the size of the generated sorry, size of the generated code. The impact of the size of the register and addressing mode field on the instructions average instruction size, and which affects the program. This is what we have discussed. The number of register and addressing mode will impact on the size of the instruction, and size of the instruction is will affect the size of the program code that generated. Now desire to have instruction encodes into length easy to handle in a pipeline implementation. Now you want to have the instructions encoded into lengths which are easy to handle in a pipeline implementation. Now look at for any pipeline implementation, if the instructions are fixed length, then it is easier to handle. Now, so there is now a question. So do you go for a fixed length instruction or you go for a variable length instruction? So these are the some of the factors that the architect must balance on the number of registers, number of addressing modes, the size of the instruction length, whether you want to have a variable length instructions or you want to have a fixed length instructions. Now, architect wants instruction to be in multiple bytes rather than arbitrary bit length. A fixed length instructions of in multiple bytes rather than arbitrary length. So moment you say it's a arbitrary length, you had an instruction of 32 bits, then you have the instruction of 28 bits, 30 bits. Now 32 it's a in multiple of bytes and an arbitrary length. So the for pipeline implementations you need a for any pipeline implement, so easier to handle if the instructions are of fixed length. So there are competing forces, so the architect must balance with all these cases. And many desktop and server architect have chosen to use a fixed length instruction to gain implementation benefit while sacrificing the average code size. Now, let me explain this last part and we'll wind up today. So it says that the desktop and server architect to have chosen to use the fixed length instruction. One of the advantage of having a fixed length instruction is it easier to pipeline. That is why if you look at all our modern day processor are pipeline processor, so it is much easier to pipeline if you have a fixed length instruction. But where you are sacrificing if you are having a fixed length instruction, the size of the code that generated for a given program in a fixed length instruction will be more than the size of the code that we generated if we have a variable length instruction. So where you gain the benefits in the implementation where we are sacrificing in the average size of the code that it generated for the program. So in the next class we will take an example on this and we'll discuss. Now it's already time, so you can leave the team and you can join for the next class.
Sir,
Yes.
sir, in the last point you talked about fixed size instructions. Then what about the size? Means, is it preferable to take in power of 2 or any arbitrary?
No, it's not. We will discuss next class. It's not. It cannot be arbitrary. The reason for
Okay.
reason that we don't take for an arbitrary is that the implementation. Finally, you design something where there is a large complexity in implementation, and you pay a penalty in the implementation. Then
Yes, sir.
you we'll look at in the next. I had one more slide. We'll find out how we went for a fixed length instruction. Then what was the problem with having a fixed length instruction? So people have again designed for a fixed length instruction, but they are all smaller size. Larger size instruction of fixed length and smaller size instruction of fixed length. So we'll discuss this one in the next class.
Okay, sir.
Sir,
Yes.
we are unable to find the link of your OneDrive. Can you share
No,
it?
no. I have mailed you. Check in one of the mail. I have shared with everyone that what will be the link for the drive.
Okay, sir.
And I have tested also. It is working correctly.
Okay, sir.